Hi everyone, welcome. Happy, very, very, very happy Tuesday. Happy 420. Lots of great news coming through the internet and the television with in regards to justice. So I just wanted to jump the call off with that, feeling lots of waves of gratitude, but also reflection, deep reflection. My name is Rashina. I will introduce myself. I program the events at the Alchemist Kitchen. The Alchemist Kitchen, if you do not know, is a botanical dispensary located in Manhattan, New York. We celebrate the power of plants. This topic in particular, CBD and cannabis, is really, really close to our hearts. Hi, Lee. Hi, Leah. This is a topic that is close to our hearts as it is part of our legacy at the Alchemist Kitchen. We originated as a botanical dispensary that was known for our plant alchemy CBD, and Micaela, who is hosting this class, has really been instrumental in providing education for our wisdom blog readers, our consumers, as she used to be an on-site herbalist at the store. So it's really always lovely to have her join us because it goes back to our legacy. So I'm very excited for this call. I'm very excited to be able to provide you with the recording after. And without further ado, Micaela, I'll pass it off to you.
Okay. I'm unmuted now, right?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here on this beautiful afternoon, or at least it's beautiful here in the Northeast. Today's 420, which, as some of you or most of you probably know, is like a holy grail day in the cannabis community. It's kind of a silly story that I won't really get into right now, but you can give it a quick Google if you're interested. It's a really nice time of year to be having this discussion. It's getting warm, seedlings are going into the ground, it's Taurus season. It's like that really nice plushy sensory time of year. So I'm really happy to be here today and to be talking with all of you. I'm going to reserve time at the end for questions and answers, and we'll try to just get through this, hopefully not too quickly, but we will have questions and answers at the end. So if you have any questions, you can type it in the chat box, and I'll try to get to all of them. Usually this is a pretty question heavy seminar. So anyways, we'll talk about today cannabis and CBD specifically for anxiety, pain, and digestion, but we'll get into some other uses as well because there really are so many. Okay, so really, we've been hearing a lot about cannabis and CBD and hemp and cannabis related things in the past couple years. And a lot of people are like, why now, right? Like, why is this the time that cannabis is really coming to the forefront of our culture? And I think there's a lot of reasons for this, but one particular reason is because it's really big medicine, right? So I'm an herbalist. I'm a clinical herbalist. I have clients and I use a large pharmacopoeia of different herbs. And a lot of herbs work in pretty subtle ways. Like if you've ever taken, a tincture for, sleep or digestion or something like that, that's going to have its physiological effects, but it's generally not going to have hugely psychoactive effects, right? But cannabis, on the other hand, does. Cannabis is really powerful, and especially the way that folks are growing it these days. It's something that is particularly potent. So cannabis is interesting because I think just broad spectrum, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, is that it really gives us the container mentally and psychoactively and physically also to create the opportunity to change. And I think that one of the most important parts of the healing journey, especially an herbal or holistic healing journey, is to have a safe container in which to change, and it's to make changes. And cannabis is really not a silver bullet. It's not a cure-all. It's not the only thing that we need to do if we want to really engage in this way. But I want to say that, yeah, cannabis is it's it's a way in which to create space and hold space in order for us to take a break from the sort of constant hypervigilance and the rate at which we sort of are expected to perform in this modern society. Our culture and the rate at which we do things, and the toxins we're exposed to, and the information overload, and the collective trauma really leads to largely these itises, which are inflammation related, pain, anxiety, digestive issues, insomnia, and things like this that sort of naturally come up with this environment that we've created. So I think cannabis is, in a lot of ways, up for the challenge of creating that space for us that a lot of times we have trouble creating for ourselves. So I think that that's one thing that's quite interesting about this plant. So I want to talk about cannabis versus CBD or hemp. This was one of the big lessons that we taught in the early days at the Alchemist kitchen. And now I'm pretty sure folks are more aware of this, but that cannabis and CBD and hemp, they're all from the cannabis plant. They're all the same plant. They're all cannabis sativa. From cannabis comes three natural subspecies: cannabis sativa of the same name, cannabis indica, and cannabis ruderalis. And usually what folks are familiar with is sativa or indica, or some sort of hybrid of those two. Ruderalis is usually the wild cannabis, so that grows everywhere from East Asia to the Midwestern United States. You can find ruderalis growing in the side of the road in Kansas, interestingly enough. But hemp or industrial hemp, really, and CBD are largely marketing tactics. It's and legal classifications. So hemp or CBD is classified by the government as a plant that's no more than 0.3% THC by dry weight volume. So this classification was established in 2018. It had existed before a little bit, but it was basically firmed up in the Farm Bill and was basically detailed to include CBD products and extracts and other cannabinoids that are non-psychoactive and derivatives of hemp. So even hemp seed oil, hemp cordage, hemp rope, hemp clothing, that's all coming from the cannabis sativa plant. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I like to just refer to this plant as cannabis rather than making a distinction, because they really are the same plant. So going forward, when I'm talking about CBD rich strains, I'll say that, but largely we'll refer to this as cannabis. Yeah, so just a little bit more. CBD is an extract, actually. So CBD doesn't actually refer to the plant. Hemp refers at least to the plant, but CBD is an extract of CBD is a cannabinoid, really. So it's one phytochemical constituent in this plant. And usually CBD is extracted from the cannabis flower. It's like THC. THC is the other really well-known cannabinoid. The cannabinoids are basically the plant-based chemicals in this plant. So THC interacts with different receptors in the brain than CBD does. There's a little bit of overlap, but THC largely interacts with CB1 receptors in the brain, and this causes more of the psychoactive effects, whereas CBD and certain other cannabinoids that we'll talk about in a bit interact with CB2 receptors, which are primarily found in the body. So these receptors are interesting. They're part of our endocannabinoid system, which we'll talk about more. And they determine, which cannabinoid interacts with which receptor determines the effects. And we also make our own endogenous cannabinoids, which just means cannabinoids that our body produces, which are called 2-AG and anandamide. And basically, cannabinoids like CBD and THC are mimicking what those chemicals do in our body. So CB2 receptors are primarily concentrated in the immune and gastrointestinal systems. And like I said, CB1 receptors are in the brain, and then they're sprinkled throughout the body a little bit as well. So I apologize, this looks a little pixelated now that it's on the bigger screen, but the 4 cannabis varieties really that we see these days are cannabis sativa, which is narrow leaf. So you can see on the far left of the screen, a cannabis sativa leaf tends to be a little pointier, a little narrower. Cannabis indica, which is 2 over, tends to be more broad-leafed. Sometimes you'll refer to these, you'll hear these referred to as narrow-leafed hemp and broad-leafed hemp. They're just referring to the subspecies of cannabis that the hemp was grown from. Hybrids, which is in the middle of the sativa and the indica, are quite common these days. And the hybrids are actually usually bred with ruderalis, which is all the way on the right, because ruderalis doesn't have a very in-your-face characteristics, but it breeds nicely with the sativa or the indica or both. So the hybrids are usually a combo of sativa, indica, and ruderalis in some form. So those are the 4 things that you usually see today. So just a bit about the ethnobotany and the history of medicinal use. Though cannabis has exploded in popularity recently, it's actually a very ancient plant. It's a dioecious plant. We use the female flowers typically, although for hemp purposes or for CBD purposes or for industrial hemp purposes, so like cloth and things like that, we might use the male plant. In the wild, cannabis is wind pollinated. It grows really tall and bushy. This is due to that fact. It's sort of reaching for the wind, and it has all these nice like pollens that sort of disperse and they find each other. And so the female flowers are pollinated via wind or synthetically mostly these days. The cannabis root is also medicinally viable. It doesn't contain CBD or THC or actually any cannabinoids, but it does have quite potent anti-inflammatory properties, and certain cultures use it for poultices, which is like a macerated topical application, or as a tea, which usually accompanies something like a cancer protocol. Cannabis is indigenous to Eastern Asia and the Middle East. The first recorded use for cannabis, which is certainly not the first human use, but the first written use we have is about 10,000 years ago in Taiwan, where it was used for fiber and food, and actually as so fiber in order to decorate different like potteries and things like that. It's quite beautiful. The leaves also. Cannabis makes really, really good. If anybody's ever used hemp cord or had cannabis clothing, it is quite strong fiber, and so makes sense. The oldest medicinal uses were in an ancient Chinese pharmacopoeia, which was written in 2700 BC, and it lists cannabis as an anesthetic. So for pain, right, which is something we'll talk about today. But it's also in formulas for about 120 different forms of disease, including like menstrual disorders and topical wounds and things, and insomnia and things like that. The ancient Egyptians used cannabis to treat glaucoma, which is actually still an effective medicine for that disorder, and just sort of inflammation at large. It was mixed with milk, so this is sort of like a precursor to a cannabis oil or something. A lot of the constituents from cannabis are more readily extracted from fat rather than water, like a lot of herbs. But again, used as like an anesthetic, a pain medicine, a sleep aid, a digestive aid. And then in the 19th century, so this skips ahead a lot, and there's actually lots of articles on the Alchemist Kitchen website if you want to read more about the history of cannabis and more about that. So check that out. I'm not going to get too bogged down in it, but yeah, in the 19th century, cannabis was actually really popular in Western medicine. And I guess in between that too, if we're going to talk about the US, colonists, early colonial peoples from Europe were actually required to grow a certain amount of hemp or cannabis on their land if they were given parcels of land by England, because it was so popular and it was so useful. It could be used as food, it could be used as cordage, it could be used to make the sails of ships, it could be used to make clothes. And so everybody was actually required to grow it if they were sort of gifted this parcel of land as just sort of a reciprocity act. George Washington grew it, had like several acres. He kept a really detailed journal about growing cannabis. And many of the sort of like founding colonial folk of yore. And then in the 19th century, so this is sort of the point at which modern medicine starts to move away from herbal medicine, because herbal medicine is really the traditional medicine. But at the time that we start to see pharmaceuticals, cannabis is really popular. It was a central ingredient in several patented medicines, and there were 2,000 named medicines containing cannabis in circulation in the US and Europe in the early 1900s. And those were produced by 300 manufacturers, including like Eli Lilly and a lot of recognizable names in the US. And it was also really fashionable for the sort of like wealthy echelon of the turn of the century to the 1920s to smoke hashish, which is a more traditional European preparation of cannabis. Prior to 1937, when the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, which banned its production and distribution, which has very racist roots. I tend to never use the word marijuana because it was used, it was basically popularized in order to make cannabis seem foreign in response to an influx of, yeah, here we go. in response to an influx of Mexican refugees following the Mexican Revolution. This is what they called cannabis that they smoked. And this just has really racist roots. Again, there's a lot more information on this for our purposes today. I'm going to kind of skim over it, but I'll just mention too that Black and Brown people are definitely disproportionately arrested and charged with harsh and really truly outlandish sentences and incarcerations due to cannabis. And the fact that the cannabis industry today looks the way it does, which is very white and mostly affluent folks, that is a huge injustice. And if you are somebody who is wanting to use cannabis as a medicine, I really ask that you do some research into that. And I have some resources on the last slide, but the Last Prisoner Project is a great resource for helping to free folks who are incarcerated on minor cannabis charges. I recently wrote an article called "The Changing CBD Agriculture," I believe was the title of it, but it's on the Alchemist Kitchen Wisdom blog. And it goes a lot more in depth about sort of the institutional racism that the cannabis industry largely and very flagrantly still promotes. So unfortunately, that's where we are, but hopefully things are changing. So when I'm talking about cannabis, I'm talking about it from an herbal perspective. I've worked in the cannabis industry in a couple of different facets, but in my practice today, I do use it somewhat regularly, depending on clients' wants and needs. But I think that it's always really important to be in right relationship with any herb or plant that you're working with. So what does right relationship mean? It means that you want to use the herb closest to its natural state. Obviously, usually there's some processing involved. But in terms of cannabis, whole plant extract is always, truly always what you want. The more holistic the herbal extract, the more holistically it will address your needs. Whole plant extracts, there have been studies done up to literally 300 times more effective than isolates. Unfortunately, most of the studies, and especially the early studies, have used CBD isolates, which really just don't have the entourage effect, which is all the other cannabinoids. And we'll talk just briefly about some of the other cannabinoids, but cannabis doesn't just have CBD and THC. It has a whole host, I think it's 112 named cannabinoids that we're not even really sure, like what this is doing yet. So, but they're affecting us positively. So that's important. So whole plant extract is always best. Really stay away from the isolates would be my advice. And also sourcing matters a lot. You want to look for heirloom varieties. You want to look for organic strains. You want to kind of stay away from hybridized flower if you are able to, or feminized seeds if you are looking to grow. These are both really genetically modified preparations. So I tend to stay away from them. It's really hard to find organic seeds, and it's really hard to find heirloom varieties, but ask around and look it up on the internet. And my email, I believe, is on the first slide. So if you need resources, I didn't want to blast them out to the interwebs because they hadn't gotten permission, but I can point you in the right direction. And then The second thing that's really important in using cannabis is that you seek individualized assessment. So not just going to your local bud tender and saying like, what strain do you recommend, or like, what's your favorite, but working with somebody who understands where your imbalance is coming from and can match you with the energetic compatibility of the plant. So somebody who's experiencing insomnia or a ton of pain is going to use a really different preparation than somebody who's experiencing really high levels of anxiety and mania and something like that. And that's going to look different to somebody who's experiencing chronic IBS. So you want to just have some knowledge of like what that looks like and what your energetic assessment is, and things like this. So rather than going in blindly and sort of doing trial and error, I really recommend seeking some sort of individualized attention. And then 3, you want to use the correct dose, and you want to use cannabis in moderation. I'm assuming most people who are taking this webinar are not taking this webinar to find out the best way to get high. That's a different webinar, which is totally fine too. But if you're looking to use cannabis for medicinal purposes, the using the correct dose, so starting low, going slow, using it in moderation. You want to just use what you need. You don't want to overuse, especially if you're using it for chronic issues, because folks' tolerances will rise over time by and large. So really pay attention to that. You want to find the minimum effective dose. And then 4, you want to use the correct form and method of medicinal use. So that's quite simple. I mean, are you going to use it as a tincture? Are you going to use it as a capsule? Are you going to combust it? Are you going to inhale it? Are you going to use it topically? And that can really make all the difference as well. So cannabis, as I mentioned in the previous slide, has its own energetics, and every herb has its own energetics and its own actions. So cannabis over the long term is cooling. So if you are somebody that has a naturally cold, energetic makeup, you might not want to use cannabis all day, every day, because that could exacerbate some of your cool tendencies, right? And not just you got cold really easily, but your energetics in terms of how your body works. So cooling is it's a slow energy, whereas hot is like tends to be a fast energy. So cannabis is cooling and relaxing. If you're somebody who is more of like on the hypo side of things, on the slower metabolism side of things, on the colder side of things, then cannabis, you'll have to look at sort of the forms, and maybe we can do something where we combine cannabis with an herb that balances out that cooling thing. So that's why you really want the individual attention. You can combine cannabis and ginger, cannabis and cayenne, or cannabis and cinnamon, and have something that's going to balance that out, so it's not exacerbating your natural state of imbalance. And we all have natural states of imbalance, but so something to keep in mind. Its actions are antiemetic, which means it reduces vomiting, antispasmodic. As many folks probably know, it's great for seizures, muscle tension, muscle spasms, things like that. It's analgesic, so it's great for pain, anti-inflammatory, great for bringing down inflammation and modulating inflammation. It can be an appetite suppressant or stimulant, depending on the profile of that specific plant or strain. It is anti-cancer and antioxidant, which are sort of in the same realm, but cannabis can really help with healthy cell death or apostasis, which we'll talk about in a moment. And it can be a sedative or it can be a stimulant. So this is a plant with a lot of different forms, and it can have a lot of different actions. So cannabis is soothing, and this information on this slide comes to me from one of my teachers, Karen Sanders, from Blue Otter School of Herbal Medicine out in Northern California. So her and her wife, Sarah Holmes, have been wonderful teachers to me, and they are very learned about cannabis and all herbs. But cannabis is soothing, so it soothes energy, right? So it brings us back from a state of reactivity to a state of removedness, sort of. So it's helping to smooth the jagged edges. However, if we're using it chronically, it can create more densities. It can aggravate the coldness, right? It can aggravate the lack of movement in the body. We don't want to totally diminish that movement and that activity. We want that balance, right? So yeah, and then under those densities can be really create sort of more intense fracturing. So we don't want to abuse cannabis. It's fine to use it regularly, but we don't want to abuse it chronically. Um, if you think of the sort of stereotype of the classic stoner, right? There's like chill, whatever, like I don't care about that, that's cool, whatever, right? Like there's that persona. But under the surface, there tends to be a lot of pent up emotions, anger, and frustration that really haven't been processed. And so, like I was saying, we want to use cannabis to create a container in which to heal, but we don't want to create a bubble around ourselves where we're not dealing with anything and we're not processing anything. We don't want to use it as a tool of removal from our life, right? Like that can actually be counterintuitive. We want to create a safe space so we can heal and we can change. It's like that sort of chrysalis, like butterfly thing. But we also, yeah, we want to not sort of like wrap ourselves in the safety blanket and not look up and not deal with the things that we need to deal with. Cannabis is a ceremonial plant. It's often, or it has traditionally been used to open the self up to spiritual advice and guidance. It can release the mind's control of the body, right? We see that with a lot of like the anxiety medicines and things like this. And cannabis can really help us to evolve. It can help us move through the tough stuff. It can increase present time and awareness. It can allow exploratory thought and behavior. It can really sort of like create that container again. But chronic use can lead to our boundaries being a little bit too open too. So we can like be in the bubble or we can be like blown wide open. So it depends on how we're using, how we're relating to this medicine. Both my teacher Karen Sanders and another dear teacher Tammy Sweet both classify cannabis as being coyote medicine. So it's trickster medicine. It's really like it's working with you and then it's working against you. So we want to always be in right relationship with it. Cannabis also takes away from dream time. If anybody is a chronic cannabis user, uses it for insomnia, you'll tend to notice that you don't have as many dreams. So we need our dream time also to process information, impression, and emotion and things like this. It's indicated specifically for things like muscle spasms, seizures, MS, lupus, Parkinson's, cancer, anxiety, digestive issues, migraines, persistent nausea. It's great for chemo protocols. And then I will just say that it's contraindicated in kidney disorders. They tend to stay away from that. Your kidneys have to process out all the tar. So especially for smokers, this can tax kidneys, so stay away from in patients who have like nephritis or advanced diabetes and things like that. And it's not that they can't use it, it's just that quite often they shouldn't smoke it. So, and I think that something interesting too with cannabis is that it really addresses these chronic sort of not always named illnesses that have been dismissed in the past. My teacher, Tammy Sweet, says that cannabis addresses a lot of times things that have traditionally been women's problems or, people with estrogen dominant bodies. So things like migraines, things like PMDD and PMS, things like infertility issues. We actually have a lot of cannabinoid receptors in the uterus and the reproductive organs. So sometimes infertility can go hand in hand with an endocannabinoid deficiency, and things like hysteria or being not able to fully process onslaughts of emotions. Cannabis can be a really great medicine, and it's interesting because we use the female flower, so just thinking about that synergy as well. So how does cannabis work in the body? The endocannabinoid system, or the ECS, it's the system for safety and well-being. The endocannabinoid system wasn't discovered until the 90s, which is quite interesting, but it's basically a master system in the body that holds the other systems. So digestive system, nervous system, metabolic system, things like that. The endocannabinoid system is basically a fine tuner. It's going around and it's saying which system needs support. Is it this system? Is it that system? So we're supplementing with cannabis and CBD that can help to rectify an endocannabinoid deficiency. And when you get an endocannabinoid deficiency, basically this happens when we're inflamed for a long time, when we're stressed for a long time, when we are running ragged. Basically, we're not nourishing ourselves, we're just depleting our resources. And so in these cases, which is a lot of us, right? So in these cases, phytocannabinoid supplementation can help to rectify this, right? Which is great. Long term, we want to address the root of the chronic inflammation or the chronic depletion. We want to get to the root of it, so we can combine herbs, we can combine lifestyle changes and things like this. But phytocannabinoids can be a really great stopgap in the middle of that. And again, they work by mimicking anandamide 2-AG. We have cannabinoid receptors all throughout our body and even on the mitochondria of our cells. Cannabinoids help to signal healthy cell death or apoptosis, which is why cannabis is so helpful in cancer treatment, because cancer is basically cells not knowing when to die, right? So cannabis can help our cells recognize when it's time to be taken. And then a nourished endocannabinoid system is neuroprotective. So phytocannabinoids can be neuroprotective. They can aid in neural plasticity. And so this is why cannabis and cannabinoids are really helpful with things like PTSD, or depression and cognition and learning. It's really helps us to rewire pathways in the brain. It helps us to think about things differently, and it helps us to make different connections, and it helps actually to protect our neural cells. So this is an important medicine for these things. It's great for pain relief, sleep, insomnia, but really, if the reason is a deficient endocannabinoid system, if the reason is something else, such as hormonal or something like that, this can help, but it probably won't sign and seal the deal. You'll need to work with some other avenues. And then the endocannabinoid system also prevents the amygdala from hijacking our brain and limbic system. So the amygdala is what causes us to worry. It's an important tool for survival. You can thank your ancestors for that and for their literal survival, which is why you're sitting here today. But the amygdala compares everything that happens or could possibly happen to the worst possible thing that can happen. Again, it's important, but it's not serving us really, right? So cannabis and the endocannabinoid system can override that and allow us to come to our heart space and not be so reactive. So it allows more communication basically in the neural pathway between the amygdala and the front cortex, which is the last part of our brain to develop. It's what makes us adult and responsible and empathetic and things like that. So It's important, and again, it's just buying us time. It's giving us a little bit of a container to go from. Okay, so let's talk about methods of medicinal use. This is just a little chart that I made, but there's a couple different methods that I recommend for my clients. Oral, which is sort of like eating it, swallowing it. So this can be capsule, this can be an edible form. And then this is just tells a little bit about the onset of action, the peak effect, and then the duration. So you want to think about how long are you wanting to wait before you get the effects of the cannabis, right? Are you somebody who has chronic pain or chronic digestive inflammation, and you know that an hour after you wake up, you're going to get heartburn? So you take the capsule when you wake up, and that's got you set for 6 hours. And then you take another capsule 6 hours after that, and that's got you set for the day. Or are you somebody who has anxiety and you have breakthrough panic attacks, and you need that cannabis to work right away? So there's oral capsule, which you swallowed. There's oral sublingual, which is an oil or tincture generally under the tongue. That's a lot shorter of an onset. That's about 15 minutes. The peak effect is quicker, and then it's going to last potentially for about the same time, or a little bit less if you've got a little bit of that quicker metabolism. And then inhalation, which is smoking, vaping. I am just going to come out and say that I don't recommend dabbing or hash oil. I don't think that that is being in right relationship with the plant. It takes a ton of plant material to make that resin, and it's usually very high THC. It's not good for your lungs. A lot of times we're not sure about the solvent. Dabbing is not a medicinal preparation, so let's not do that for health issues, in my opinion. But smoking, vaping, I don't generally recommend this to my clients unless they're already using in this way, or unless they're having really debilitating sudden onset symptoms like anxiety attacks or muscle spasms or something like that. And in which case I'll usually recommend an oral tincture, sublingual oil, and then having the smoking or vaping as a backup, just in case of those breakthrough symptoms. And then we've also got topical salve and oil, balm or cream, which can be great. Again, that's just gonna be really targeted though. That's great for bruising, swelling, bad knee, muscle soreness, things like that. But that's going to be pretty targeted. So if it's something that's chronic, we're going to want to do oral plus topical to address specific areas. So dosing, we want to start low and go slow. Everyone has their own dose, and you want to find the lowest effective dose because tolerance will often rise. The general guidelines are small baseline dosage, 2 to 5 milligrams, 2 to 3 times daily. So for a 6 to 10 milligram total daily, that's where you really start to see change. So whether it's cannabis or whether it's CBD, and if you're advising somebody who has never used cannabis and who has never used CBD, I'd suggest start out with CBD, see how that goes, and then we can move on to adding in THC and things like that. But basically, I have certain clients who do really well with the baseline dosage, about 10 milligrams total daily. You want to maintain the baseline dosage for about 7 days. You want to take note of how it's interacting with your body. Where do you feel it? Is it touching the thing that you wanted it to touch? Is it what are the symptoms? What are the side effects? How do you feel? Things like this. After about a week, if it's not working out for you, let's go up 2 milligrams every couple days, 2 to 3 days, until we find the dosage that works best for you. And then once that dosage is touching that thing, once that dosage dosage is really sort of like soothing that symptom, then we want to stay there, and we can increase it a little bit if if the symptom starts to overcome the dosage. This is just a helpful little chart too. With children, again, and pets, start lower and go slower, because a lot of times they're not going to be able to effectively convey what they're feeling. But this is just sort of like a weight chart, and with the condition range in mind too, right? So we can kind of disregard the baseline if the person is in severe pain or the person is doing a cancer protocol or something like this. We can jump up a little bit. I typically, and I'll just say, start with CBD, especially if the person doesn't use cannabis recreationally and doesn't want any psychoactive effects. But the next step up is going to be a 1-to-1 tincture. So 1 part CBD to 1 part THC. And I find that that really rarely has a psychoactive effect, because CBD and THC in the natural state of the cannabis plant are pretty well balanced. And they're that way for a reason. They're balancing each other out. So if anybody's ever experimented with super high concentration THC preparations and gotten anxious from it or paranoid or anything like that, that's often due to a lack of CBD. The CBD is, sort of like the anxiety calming cannabinoid. So the two are sort of meant to be synergistic with each other. But a lot of times the recreational preparations will have either bred that out or extracted out the CBD in order for the user to experience more of a high. Okay, so specifically for anxiety, let's start with the basic dosing guidelines. Oral and sublingual oils, I find, are really sort of the best method personally that I've found. You want to stay away from that high THC concentration. As I was saying, that can really exacerbate anxiety, that can exacerbate paranoia. So sticking to hemp cannabis or CBD cannabis preparations at first is great. Again, like I was saying, we might do a sublingual oil and an inhalation device if the person is having panic attacks or basic functioning is impaired. And then also, I really encourage the use of other herbal allies at the same time, so we can sort of like build up the nervous system and the adrenal glands, which are often taxed when we're having really bad anxiety. So herbs that are really like feeding those systems, because cannabis is feeding those systems in the way that the endocannabinoid system is like maintaining and like sort of balancing everything. But we really want to give those two sort of specific systems food. So milky oats is really great. Ashwagandha, skullcap, passion flower. You know, I could go on, but it depends on the person's constitution, and it depends on a whole host of factors, energetics and things like that. So, but we also want to be doing other herbs at the same time, ideally, and we want to be making some lifestyle changes, and maybe we want to look at the diet, and we want to look at sort of the psycho-emotional factors as well. But in the meantime, this CBD and inhalation of CBD can be really, really effective. Other cannabinoids to look for in preparations, if you're into this kind of thing, I don't really worry about like the other named cannabinoids that we see popping up too much, but some folks are interested and I get a lot of questions about it. So CBG is an early precursor, so it comes before CBD and THC turn into CBD and THC. So its early harvested plants will be really high in this compound. And if folks are wanting to use a THC preparation, strains that are high in CBG are a little bit less likely to cause anxiety. So they can be good for both psychoactivity and not so much anxiety hand in hand with that. For pain, we're running out of time. Okay, I'll speed it up a little bit. For chronic but not debilitating pain, I usually start with a 1-to-1 preparation, again, THC to CBD. The oral sublingual is my preferred method, and you want to start about 10 milligrams, depending on the size of the person and the severity of the pain, 2 to 3 times a day. For severe pain, you want to start at that dose and then work up. You can also do the inhalation for breakthrough pain, or to manage it a little bit, or to experiment. Indicas usually I'd use for pain and body aches. And then also, if the person is in so much pain that they are taking opiates but would like to stop, it's possible to use THC-rich preparations of cannabis to titrate away from opiates. THC potentiates opiates by up to 30%. So we can actually use 30% less opiates with the same results in severe pain patients. So that's really important. That can be really, really helpful, especially as addiction is a really big issue for folks who are using opiates, and also tolerance to opiates rises really quickly. So we can experiment with using higher levels of THC and things like this. I will also say that California poppy is a great herb as a stand-in when titrating away from prescription opiates and mitigating pain symptoms. Other herbs like kava and St. John's wort and ghost pipe essence are things that I've found really effective. And you always want to work, of course, with a professional herbalist and or doctor to titrate away from any prescription drug. Other cannabinoids to look out for pain, CBN. It's actually like the older form of THC. As it breaks down, CBN levels will increase. CBN has been shown to be good for pain. It can kind of be like more of that couch melty effect, but it's not as psychoactive as THC. Might have some mild psychoactivity, but it's nice for treating like pain that goes with insomnia, pain that goes with anxiety, where you want to get the high THC, but you don't want to exacerbate the anxiety or the insomnia. And then CBDA, which comes from the fresh cannabis plant, can really sort of mimic NSAIDs, so things like ibuprofen. And so CBDA is really interesting. Like, it's not a stable cannabinoid because it has to be fresh, and as time goes on, it turns into CBD and THC. But if you can, and I know certain brands have been able to preserve the CBDA as a CBDA. So that's an interesting one to look out for too. And I know that it's becoming a little bit more popular, so you might see it more in the mainstream. But yeah, so CBDA as a way to sort of replace the ibuprofen and aspirin supplementation, things like that. For digestion, we want to start with the basic guidelines because that's typically for digestion, low doses are good. It depends on what type of digestive issues we're looking at, but yeah, so digestion, I usually use the capsules or the edibles because you really want the CBD or the cannabinoids or the cannabis to get into the stomach. And I also like using complementary herbs here too. But yes, for things like severe pain and nausea and cramping, loss of appetite, high THC is recommended. But for chronic issues like Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, IBS, chronic pain and inflammation in the gut, I think the 1-to-1 sublingual or 1-to-1 capsules or edibles are recommended. For low-grade inflammation, often CBD capsules or sublingual are just fine. And again, we want to do complementary herbs here. Powders like gelatin or collagen, peptides if they do animal products. We want to do daily infusions with gut healing herbs that are like calendula, raspberry leaf plantain, burdock, marshmallow, meadowsweet, etc. We want to do broths. We want to do dietary changes, and yeah, those are other things to look at, because obviously something is irritating the gut and we don't want to just toss CBD on top of it and call it a day. Other cannabinoids for digestion, THCV, which is like THC, but it's less psychoactive again. So it's great for appetite stimulation, but for folks who don't want to feel high. CBDA, again, which we just talked about, is also great for nausea and anxiety. There's one study that said it was 1,000 times more powerful than CBD for anti-nausea and anti-anxiety, but I don't know how much I believe that it's 1,000 times more effective, but it's something to look for if you're considering different preparations and one has CBDA, and these are the reasons that you want it. Just an important last little note, cannabis, as we talked about with opiates, potentiates pharmaceuticals often. Any herb you put in your body will have an effect on any pharmaceutical medication you're taking. Maybe it's noticeable, maybe it's not, maybe it's a problem, maybe it's a good thing. As a rule of thumb, if your medication says that you should avoid grapefruit, then you want to avoid supplementing with large doses of cannabis regularly, or you want to talk to your doctor and do some more research and consult with a physician, consult with an herbalist, because it speeds up the metabolism in your liver, basically, which is what processes out all the pharmaceuticals. And that can lead to undesirable results if you're on something like birth control, where you need to maintain a steady thing, or you're on some other sort of like maybe like a behavioral medication. So you want to just take care to look at that. In other ways, this could be a good thing, as in with the opiates, you can take less with the same effect. And yeah, just according to a Medicare study that I thought was interesting, so a non-biased third-party study, in states where cannabis was legal, opiate addiction-based deaths dropped, and number of opiate it's supposed to say prescriptions significantly dropped, and that was directly correlated to the number of medical cannabis prescriptions. And I think that this is part of the reason that legalization has dragged on in a lot of states, because there's a lot of money in pharmaceuticals, unfortunately. Also, just a note, those with a family history of psychosis, especially schizophrenia, should not use high THC preparations unless you consult with a counselor and a doctor and things like that. It's not that those folks can't use cannabis, it's just something to be aware of, and proceed with caution. And then this is just some resources. The Color of Cannabis is a really cool organization that's sort of helping to pave the pathway to restorative justice, and using funds from cannabis to pay reparations and go back into communities. Last Prisoner Project, which focuses on getting folks out of prison who are imprisoned for cannabis-related crimes. And then Tammy Sweet, who is one of my teacher, and she is a cannabis queen. She is really coming at cannabis from an herbal perspective and has done a lot of really interesting research. She recently put a book out called Holistic Healing Guide to Cannabis, and so that's an interesting resource too. So I think that about sums up the talking points that I had. And so if we are gonna look at the chat, it looks like we've got some interesting questions. Hi, Carrie. Thanks so much. Anybody got a question? So Leah says, I do CBD oil, THC, but cannabis is no good for me. Can I have low intolerance for THC? Yeah, definitely. Sometimes THC exacerbates either like the way our minds work or the way our bodies work. And it's kind of, yeah, it's not good for everybody, definitely. I know a lot of people also, as they get older, move away from THC because it can really alter the way that you think and feel. So yeah, definitely. Judy says, if someone were to start to use cannabis medicinally, what would be recommended? To that, I would say it depends on really what you're using it for. So, if you were using it for, so again, I think we went over that a little bit after that question was asked, but yeah, so I tend to prefer sublingual oils or tinctures, but edibles can be great too. Again, it just depends on what you're using it for, how often you're using it, and sort of the symptoms you're hoping to reconcile with that. Gianna says, I make my own CBD oil and use it 2 to 3 times a day for mood focus and to help with sleep. I don't think that is necessarily too much. Honestly, I don't think like there is a too much and not enough. I mean, yeah, you're using it 2 to 3 times a day. That's great. Since you make it yourself, maybe we don't know the milligram content. If you're cool with taking it that many times a day and you feel good and that's working for you, then I think that that's great. CBD oil is anti-inflammatory, and if it's helping you with your mood and focus and it's helping you with your sleep, then that's great. If you're averse to sort of like leveling up the milligrams eventually, if you're finding that it's not proving to be as effective, then you can either up the dose or take a break too is another option. We can always take breaks from herbs and then revisit them in a couple of weeks. And then Paula asked, how do you measure milligrams when using the inhalation method, weighing the flowers? So that's a really good question, actually. It depends on the inhalation device. The inhalation devices are going to be different, and the way that people inhale are going to be different. So the way that you would measure it is by how much oil you're inhaling or by how much flower you're inhaling. Yeah, so with the milligrams, weighing the flowers wouldn't necessarily do it, because really what you're measuring is the cannabinoid content in the flowers. So you would more have to get the flowers tested and then do the weight by volume and then weigh the flowers and then sort of measure how much you've inhaled and combusted. But also, again, once you light something on fire, you're not inhaling all of it all of the time. So that's one of the trickiest ones to measure in milligrams. So it kind of depends. Sorry, I don't have a more specific answer to that. And then what's the difference between sativa and indica? That is a good question. There are different subspecies. Typically, sativas are more energizing. They are more conducive to like cognitive function and things like that. So people will say sativas can be more stimulating. For indicas, those tend to be more, so people will say sativa is more of like a mental high, creativity, energy, things like that. And then indica is more of like a bodily high where you would use it more for like pain. It's more of like that couch melty, sleepy cannabis. So that is generally the difference. And then also actually like there's this thing where like the indicas of today were the sativas of yesterday, and so but generally for your purposes, sativas tend to be a little more stimulating, indicas tend to be a little more relaxing. Thanks, JB. Besides pain, what are some other benefits for topical applications in a face cream? Yeah, topical applications can be great for inflammatory skin stuff. You can definitely use it for face cream. I know that Alchemist Kitchen has a bunch of really nice topical facial products that contain CBD. Um, yeah, those are great. Um, you could use, so I've had folks use them for things like rosacea, broken capillaries, uh, recurring poison ivy rash. Actually, I had one person do topical applications of that, not an oil based, it was a water based cream. But yeah, using it in a face cream can be great. It's antioxidant rich, and depending on the other ingredients in the cream, it can be really nourishing and beautiful. Yeah, definitely. Onset of effects for oil preparations can vary greatly. Um, yeah, definitely. Um, it can definitely, yeah, Martinez um, can definitely, oral preparations can vary greatly, also depending on like the food you have in your stomach, the rate of your metabolic intake and everything. And then, yeah, and I definitely have concerns about lung health with respect to vaping and smoking. Yeah, I don't recommend it um as the main application, but I think it's worth mentioning that it's helpful for breakthrough symptoms, and if a person is already using it in that form, sometimes it can be comfortable for them to continue using it in that form. I'd much rather see somebody smoke than see them vape. That's a personal preference. Vaping can create a really dry, hot um, sort of like environment in the lung. Um, and we don't always know the oil, we don't always know the extraction method. Humans have been smoking things for many thousands of years. So I'd rather see that. But there's definitely some concern there because anytime you're combusting anything and inhaling it, it's not great for your lungs. So we want to move away from that if we can. And then Samuel, for daily anxiety or depression, what concentration of CBD tincture would you use? Yeah, the Alchemist Kitchen makes a really, really great CBD tincture. I'm less concerned about how many milligrams are in the bottle. I'm more concerned about how many milligrams you're using. So for daily anxiety, depression, if you're new to using CBD, I'd want to visit those basic guidelines. So let's say starting out about 5 milligrams twice a day and seeing what that does and then going from there. So you could get a bottle that has 1,000 milligrams. You'll only need to take a couple drops to get that 5 milligram dose, and that'll last you a really long time. Or you could get a bottle that's 100 milligrams and you're just going to need to take more of the oil. So it's just about how many milligrams you're getting per serving and then keeping that pretty regular. So you just want to read the label on the bottle. Is it just a couple of drops that you're needing to take? Is it a dropper full? And you just want to keep that dose consistent and then see if that's working for you. If that's not working for you, you want to move up a little bit. So Samuel says, how do you know a CBD product meets a good quality standard? Is there a quality stamp? That's a really good question. You kind of have to ask around. Folks have so many different, so I will say that the Alchemist Kitchen has really, really nice quality whole plant extracts. There's you want to look for the whole plant extract, right? So you want to see that's not an isolate. That's my first recommendation. You want to see that it's a whole plant extract. You want the flower to be organic. You want the oil to be organic if possible. And then is there a quality, sorry, is there a quality stamp? There is not a quality stamp. And then I think that it's like sort of a thing of doing our research too. It's there's so much information, but it's yeah, it's just it's hard to say like a blanket statement, and then folks have, you know, different access to different things. If you're going to a dispensary, they're going to have just like different things, so I hesitate to like make a blanket one. But you want to think about sourcing, you want to look up the brands you buy before you buy them. And then yeah, I mean, I'm thinking that the main things are whole plant and the main things are organic, and that's what I look for um, when I'm sourcing a CBD product. And regenerative agriculture is another sort of buzzword that I look for um, when I'm looking up CBD. So I try to look for brands that are like putting something back into the earth rather than just like taking it. So JB, do you have a blog? I don't have a personal blog. I do have a website. It's on the first slide. It's called quintessenceherbs.com. That mostly has my herbal products, and you can book a consultation with me if you wanted to do that. But I write for the Alchemist Kitchen blog pretty regularly. So if you search my name, which is Micaela Foley, on the Alchemist Kitchen blog, you can read a lot of my articles. Or if you wanted to email me, I'm always happy to correspond that way too. And then my thoughts on Delta 8. I don't know that much about it. It's a cannabis compound. I know it's gotten a lot of like press recently. I know it's sort of like Delta, it's like THC, which is Delta 9, but it can be extracted from CBD, and it can be extracted from cannabis. I honestly, I don't feel like I know enough about it, and I don't have experience with it. So I am not quite sure what my thoughts are on it, but I could definitely look into it and give you my take on it in the future. If you wanted to reach out to me, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah. If Does anybody have any more questions? Okay. Thank you. Thank you all. You've been super great. Thanks for sitting through this on a beautiful evening. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Have a great rest of your week. If you have any questions or any follow up, feel free to reach out. Always happy to talk plants, and everybody be well. I'm wishing you all the best.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Michaela. Always a wealth of information. I tried my best to like follow up with links in the chat, but I'll put everything in the recap email, including your
Thanks.
email.
Thanks so
Thank you,
much, Rashida.
everyone. Of
You do a great
course.
job.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much, Michaela.
Thanks.
Happy 420. Happy Day of
Happy
Justice.
birthday.
Bye,
Awesome.
everyone.
Bye. Thank you.